Hello friends! Today I am going to be showing you my attempt at making the Hamilton Spencer pattern. Maybe, like me, you are a beginner wondering how possible it is to actually make this Spencer. Maybe you are looking to learn from my mistakes, which I hope will be instructive because I will probably make plenty. Maybe you are just bored and looking for something to watch. Regardless, I welcome you here. I am really excited to try this project out. There are a lot of techniques I've never tried. It's going to definitely be a challenge. It's also really awesome because all of the proceeds go to benefit the Costume Industry Coalition, and it is a really hard time to be a theater person. I know because I am one. In March, I was working professionally as a stage manager, a teaching artist, and a music director. And now I'm back working at a bakery. And I'm lucky. I really am. But it is still really hard to not be able to do the work that I had dedicated my life to. So I just really want to encourage everyone, if you have the means, please donate to any theater project that has brought you joy. Support the coalition. Costumers, they deserve all of the love. So buy the Spencer pattern, donate. If you can't, that is okay. Just keep the entire theater community in your thoughts, please, because every single crack and crevice of it is suffering. But now, out of that pit of depression, I'm gonna take you through this project. Thankfully, my printer actually cooperated with me on the first try. Putting the pattern together was pretty straightforward. The printouts were all well marked and the directions were clear. You do need a fairly large space to put it all together though, and a roll of Scotch tape. I measured myself with a soft tape measure and fell squarely into the 4/6 size, though I was worried about my arms because I am buff, and I am proud. I decided to cut the sleeves out at their largest measure, so I could experiment with mock-ups after I'd made the body of the jacket. The pattern pieces are all cut out. It only ended up taking me about an hour and a half, although I didn't cut out some of the upper sleeve and the petal pieces because I'm not a big fan of puffy sleeves. They look great on other people, just not for me, so I think I'm gonna leave those out of the project. As well as the tiny little balls on the design. Like, I don't hate them, but I don't think they add enough for me personally to want to put in the effort to do them. So I'm just not gonna do that. My fabric is from a thrift shop. This one will be used for the exterior, and this will be used for the lining, and I'm also thinking about doing trim in this. That will break up the Hamilton tone-on-tone look, but I'm worried about having enough of this, and also I do think I would like a little pop of color in there. At the thrift shop, I also found some awesome fabric that might be turned into a genderqueer Regency Gryffindor project later on, because in this house, we can enjoy things while reading them critically and also not giving our money to TERFs. I also grabbed some supplies at Joann's. I bought interfacing, some bias tape, and cording, which I later ditched for just string and yarn. If the interfacing was actually $3 like it was marked, I would have likely spent about $10 on supplies, with the dirt cheap fabric making a huge difference. I laid out my pattern pieces, which would be reflected when laid out on a folded piece of fabric to create the body of the jacket. I marked the seam allowance, which is included in the pattern pieces, all while jamming to music at a virtual Zoom dance party hosted by my buddy DJ Sparkle Daddy. Have fun out there, kids. I decided to pin the pieces together rather than sewing them because less work, and it ended up looking like a thing, and fitting pretty well. The instructions actually had a fantastic layout included for how to best set out your pattern pieces, making use of folded fabric once more for pieces where they only gave you half the shape. These were all clearly marked with place on fold. Because I didn't want to make the oversleeves or petals, I ended up altering the suggested layout and finding what worked best for me. I used a sharpened piece of chalk to trace out my outlines and then cut everything out, repeating the same process with my lining pieces. You cut strips diagonally, aka on the bias, so that they can more easily stretch around corners. I tucked some thread into the fabric strip and pinned it in place. I found a zipper foot lying around and stuck it on my machine, changing the stitch settings accordingly. Then I sewed as close as I could to the string. I folded up a second string in a strip of fabric, pinned it in place, then pinned it to the first cording I'd sewed. Once again, I tried to sew as close to the string as possible. And it looked like a thing! So I planned to include cording in my own jacket. Fun fact! If you turn off your machine, when it turns back on, the stitch settings might return to normal. And then if you tried to sew with a zipper foot, your needle might jam worse than you've ever seen it. So yeah, double check your stitch settings when you're using a zipper foot. To make the rouleau leaf trim, I started with some yarn. In my YouTube research, I found out that there's actually a really easy way to make rouleau by machine, but with my soft fabric and yarn, it didn't work very well, so I turned to hand sewing. The technique I ended up using involved rolling up the yarn and fabric, tucking both sides of the fabric inside, kind of like a little burrito. Then I went down this fold with a running stitch, taking an occasional back stitch. After that, I kind of rolled it up tighter and felled the seam down. I found that this worked even better when I was sitting cross-legged and could trap the trim between my ankles, adding a little bit of tension. I repeated this process with 6 different pieces of trim until I had successfully binge-watched all of Pushing Daisies over the course of 2 nights. And yay! I had my trim! And a cat! And my trim! I traced the leaf motifs with chalk, making use of a lamp to backlight the fabric and the paper. I then went over this with an ink pen because I'm trash, and hopefully it'll be covered by the rouleau anyway. I pinned a layer of lining to the fabric so I could flatline it, adding stability, and then I added in the facing. I outlined the very edges of this fabric with a running back stitch to hold them all together, making sure it was close enough to the edge to be hidden in the seams later on. At first, I tried to sew the leaves on from the top down, which was kind of a hot mess, and on the reverse side, my messy stitches get noticeably better as I went along. I figured out a way to sew from the facing side rather than the front. As I went along, I'd consult the lines on the front of the fabric, secure the rouleau in place, pinch it, and sew through the trim in the fabric with neat, pretty stitches. And after watching through most of Brian Fuller's lesser-known but still iconic Wonderfalls, the leaves were done, and I was really happy with how they ended up looking, front and back. I traced out where the dart should be with chalk, pinched those 2 lines together and felled it down, repeating the same process on the other side. I should also note that, by now, I'd moved on to watching Hannibal, so a lot of my raw, tranquil sewing footage is actually filled with atonal horror music at this point. So I have sewed the darts. They create a lot of floof and poof here, and I might need to go back and revisit and remake them. Thankfully they're hand sewed, so they should be easier to pick out, but the reason why I'm concerned is basically a non-binary femme person. I use she or they pronouns, and I also wear a binder / compression bra. It's not as strong as a normal binder, so I can go to the gym without having to change out of it, because you can't exercise in a regular binder, and I'm far too lazy to change in and out of one on a daily basis. But because that creates a less feminine shape, and the darts create that sort of curve outwards, I might need to play with this in order to fit it to a slightly less traditional body. I drew out where the roll line should be, where a lapel would fold back on a similar style of jacket. I used a running stitch here, though honestly, I don't really know why you're supposed to stitch it, but I did. But I don't really know why. Then I pinned down the sturdy bias tape I'd bought. It says you're supposed to use stay tape, but close enough, I think, I hope. I filled that all down nice and neat, and the inside tailoring bits ended up looking pretty cool. This step was easier than I thought it would be. I marked out the seam allowance, pinned it, sewed it by machine, and it looked like an actual thing. First try on, and I'm really happy generally with how it fits. I was concerned about the pleats, and they are kind of doing something weird. Kind of making this weird poofy thing. I think I'm going to undo, not the pleats, the darts, so this thing isn't happening. I managed to fix some of that weird poofiness that was happening by making one dart that goes further up, and then with the rest of the space that was left here, I just took it in the sort of side back seam. Much less awkward than before. I'm not quite sure what I'm doing with this, but I think I figured it out, a sort of crisscross pattern that helps to strengthen it. I snipped around the seam allowance, cut out a second collar piece with gray fabric, and sewed it to cover the stitch marks. This would be the outside of the collar. Before I could attach the whole thing to the jacket, I needed to turn and fell the seams going into the collar space. I planned to keep the flat lining fabric as the lining fabric for the back, so making these seams nice and clean felt very good. Then I sewed the collar on with a strong back stitch. Before I could attach the belt, I had to turn and fell the seams running down to the bottom of the jacket. Then I pinned the belt on. Okay, so on the side, it lined up great, having started at the front center back. But then on this side, it's a little off. I don't want to completely recut this belt, so I think I'm going to start pinning this from that side, snip it closer to the middle, and then try and add a new piece that will go along this back line, so these two seams line up with the seam which I will insert into the belt. With that piece inserted, I could sew on the belt. There's some weird bunching right where I decided not to take that second dart out, and there's also around the back where I added, it sticks out. So let's just fix that. To correct the strange way the belt stuck out, I found that if I laid it flat on a surface and pinned the excess fabric from the belt, that helped it lay flat. This was more intuitive guesswork than anything else. I don't know why it worked, but I felled down the fabric and it helped immensely. I sewed down enough cording to cover the jacket edges, after using string to guesstimate the length. I cut it down to the size of the seam allowance and pinned it to the jacket, cutting notches into the edge of the cording to help it move around the corners. I pinned these strips face down with the cords facing inward and sewed it on, trying to get as close to the cording as possible. And when I flipped that around, I saw what the final product would look like. I pinned on a piece of lining fabric to finish off the collar. I ended up going back in and felling down all of the seams left from the cording to get it to lie flat, not only on the collar, but all around the jacket. I used one piece of cording for the collar and another for the rest of the jacket. I wish I'd left more cording at the ends of these pieces because getting it to meet up cleanly without any string showing proved kinda tricky. Though I decided to leave the flat lining as the lining for the back pieces, I did end up cutting out red lining pieces for the front of the jacket. I didn't bother putting the darts in, so I just kinda chopped off the excess and stuck it in there. I neatly pinned down the lining that went towards the back of the jacket, but left the sleeves, bottom, and arm's eye pretty rough, since all of that would be covered up with other fabric or stuck into the seams. As I sewed this lining down, I was careful to catch just the flat-lined layer and not let any stitches show on the outside. I pinned down another lining piece that went on the lapel, made with the outer fabric. And then the inside of the jacket was starting to look really clean and finished. To add structure and cover up the seams at the bottom of the jacket, I used some of the stiff bias tape I had left, pinning that in and felling that down to finish off the lining. Oh look, the sleeves. When it's the only thing left, you gotta do it. I started by cutting out the sleeves at the widest size, marking the seam allowance and pinning the mock-up together like the one I'd done for the body. I found that there was plenty of room left, so I tentatively cut it down to the same 4/6 size I'd used for the rest. So down it fits. It is going to be a tight sleeve, but it fits. I am almost done with this jacket. The body is pretty much all done. The fabric for the sleeves is flatlined. All I need to do is put the sleeves together and, if I wanted to, do the trim for the sleeves. I know it's gonna take about 14 hours to do it, and I don't want the trim on there that much. If you're a beginner and you're doing this jacket and want to try it without the trim, that is perfectly alright. It will take you probably a third of the time to make the basic jacket without any of the trim. Even the YouTuber who was hired to promote this did not do, I don't think, the cording or the petals. And that's okay. I mean, not everyone is on a week-long deadline, but if you don't want to do a part of that, I think you are perfectly well allowed, and so am I. If you want to see how the trim on the sleeves is done, I recommend checking out the video on Sostein's channel. She goes into it very well. That's also how I know it takes about 15 hours. And I'm excited to have the sleeves on and to finish up this project. I flatlined the fabric and sewed it together, finding once again that the trimming and finishing took much more time and effort and hand sewing than the main construction of the jacket. I tried a finishing technique I'd never done before for the first seam, felling down both sides, but then I just turned and felled the rest. The convenient little notches on your pattern can help line up your sleeves. I started by pinning the lower sleeve panel to the arm's eye and attaching it with flat little back stitches. Even after shearing part of the sleeve to gather up a section, there was still more sleeve fabric left than arm's eye fabric. I fit the sleeve fabric in by finding the halfway point of the sleeve and the halfway point of the arm's eye and pinned them together. Then I found the midway point of what was left on either side and pinned those together to help space things out evenly. I ran a running stitch through the very edge of this sleeve and pulled it taut to help squeeze all that fabric in nice and even. I took an occasional back stitch around the pins I'd already placed, again, to help space things out evenly and keep everything in place. Then, with the same tiny back stitch, I put in the sleeves. After I got both sleeves on, I realized that the seams were not even at all. So yay, time to seam rip the one I liked less and tear it out. I folded the bottom of the sleeve back where I wanted it to fall. Apparently these are supposed to go a bit long. I pinned that fold to mark it. Then I rolled the fabric back and pinned it, felling it down and being careful to just catch the flat lining and not let the stitches show on the other side. I had some extra bias strips from the lining left, so I encased the arm's eye seams in that and tucked it down with a running stitch. There are a lot of ways I think you could potentially finish off the arm's eye seams. What you end up doing is ultimately up to you. And this is the end. If you are a beginner, I think it is possible to work on this jacket. I also think that breaking it into steps is really, really important. A lot of the hardest stuff was not complicated so much as it was tedious. Set small, reasonable, regular goals for yourself, and you can get through it much more easily than if you say, I have to do all of this now. A month or two is a pretty reasonable time to set for working on this project. I also recommend having something to listen to, some piece of media that you want to get through to work on this story. I found that a lot of times my motivation was tied to wanting to go back to a certain story. I personally went through some of my Brian Fuller favorites, although I also listened to a bunch of other stuff, including all of these things. From that, I was able to estimate that it took about 50 or 60 hours, I think, to work on this project. Now that sounds like a lot of time, but it could just be one piece of media. The War and Peace audiobook is about 60 hours. You could also watch something with 6 or 7 seasons, or even fewer seasons, depending on how many episodes there are, something like Buffy or The West Wing. My last tip would be to make the jacket that you want to make, and the jacket that you want to wear. Just because everything is written down in the instructions doesn't mean you have to do every single flourish, every single piece of lining. Let me know what you think of this video. Was it helpful to you? Are you more likely to go out and try this project now? If you are interested in more of this content, you can subscribe and press the little bell so you get notified if I make another video. I do not post regularly at this time because that's not really what this channel is about. I do have some other projects in the works. I have a kit to make a pair of stays that I'd like to do eventually. I have that Regency Gryffindor project, and if you want to come along for those, keep an eye out. Might not be this week, might not be this month, but eventually it will probably show up. And if you decide to make this jacket, good luck and Godspeed, my friends.